The apartment smelled of cold tea and washing powder. Its walls covered with faded wallpaper muffled the sounds of the city, leaving only the rustle of rain outside the window and the distant hum of the elevator. Anna sat at the kitchen table, her fingers leafing through the proofs of tomorrow's article, and the light from the table lamp fell on her face, carving shadows under her eyes, deep as cracks in the asphalt. The clock on the wall ticked, its hands crawling toward 2 in the morning, but she did not notice the time. The editor's habit stole sleep like a thief, leaving only fatigue. Mark was asleep in the bedroom, his snores muffled by the door, the only living sound in the house. Lisa, their 15-year-old daughter, had gone to her room an hour ago, her headphones flashing blue like a beacon as she closed the door. Anna sighed, her hand reaching for her mug, but froze when the phone on the table vibrated. Its screen, flashing like an eye, suddenly revealed in the darkness. The number was unfamiliar, a long string of numbers that sounded like operator error. She frowned, her finger touching the end button, but curiosity, as old as her profession, got the better of her. "Hello?" she said, her voice hoarse, as if caught in her throat. The silence answered her, but it was not empty. There was a rustle in it, faint as breath behind a curtain. Then a voice came, cold, distorted, as if it had been fed through an old speaker. "You left the window open," it said, its words flat, without inflection, like text read by a machine. Anna froze, her eyes darting to the window above the sink. It was ajar, a thin slit letting in cold air, stirring the curtain like a ghost. She stood, her chair creaking, and went to the window, her fingers shaking as she slammed the frame shut. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice sharp but cracked. Silence answered, then the call ended. The phone screen went blank as if it had been turned off. Anna looked at the number in the call log. It was empty, just the time, 2:03. She returned to the table, her hands clutching her mug, but the warmth was gone, like the life from her fingers. It had been a joke, someone playing a prank, maybe Lisa messing with the app. But the window, had she closed it before dinner, or had she? The memory was like fog, thick and unreliable. She stood up, her steps quiet as a whisper, and walked to Lisa's room. The door was ajar, the light from her headphones flickering, but her daughter was asleep, her face illuminated by the phone screen, calm as pond water. Anna closed the door, her heart beating unevenly, like a drum that had lost its rhythm. She returned to the kitchen, but sleep was no longer coming. Anxiety had taken its place, thin as a thread, stretched to the limit. In the morning, the family sat at breakfast, their voices muffled as if someone had turned up the volume on the world. Mark, in his grey shirt, scrolled through the news on his tablet, his brow furrowed the way he always did when he was thinking about work. Lisa poked at her oatmeal, her eyes glued to her phone, where notifications were ticking. Anna wanted to tell him about the call, but the words stuck in her throat like bones. It was stupid, a small thing, a coincidence. She opened her mouth, but Mark spoke first, his voice as tired as an old motor. "Have you checked the stove?" he asked, his eyes glued to the screen. "It smelled like gas yesterday." Anna shook, her head, her fingers tightening around her spoon, but she said nothing. The day passed in a grey haze. The city outside the window was like a watercolor, washed out by the rain. Anna returned from work late. Her bag fell to the floor with a dull thud, and the apartment greeted her with silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Mark was in the living room, his laptop buzzing like a swarm of insects, and Lisa had locked herself in her room again. Anna went to the kitchen, her hand reaching for the kettle, but the phone in her pocket vibrated. its screen flashing, showing Mark's number. She frowned, her gaze darting to the living room where he sat, his back motionless as a statue. "Hello?" she said, her voice weak, a whisper in the void. The same voice, cold and distorted, answered her, the words like ice sliding over her skin. "You're afraid of the dark," it said. "It's going to be longer today." Anna turned, her eyes finding Mark, his phone lying on the couch, the screen as dark as a grave. She hung up, her fingers shaking as she opened the call log. Empty, just the time, 10:17 p.m. She walked toward Mark, her steps heavy as stones falling into water. "Did you call me?" she asked, her voice sharp, but there was fear in it. He looked up, his eyebrows raised, as if she were speaking a foreign language. "No," he said, his tone dry as sand. "I was here." Anna returned to the kitchen, her hands clutching the phone as if it might provide answers. She checked the windows, the stove, the locks. Everything was closed, everything was fine, but the feeling of someone watching did not go away. She lay down on the bed, her body next to Mark, but there was a gap between them, cold as the voice on the phone. She closed her eyes, but the darkness the voice spoke of was thicker than usual, and in it, somewhere at the edge of hearing there, was a rustling as if someone was breathing too close. Rain pounded the windows of the apartment, drops running down the glass like tears no one dared shed. Anna stood at the kitchen table, her fingers clutching her phone, its screen dark but still alive, like an eye watching from the shadows. The light from the chandelier flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls covered in wallpaper with a pattern reminiscent of a maze. It was morning, but the apartment felt like night, not because of the rain, but because of the silence, heavy as concrete, that had separated the family after the second call. The voice, cold and distorted, still, sounded in her head, "You're afraid of the dark. It will be longer today." Mark sat in the living room, his laptop buzzing like a swarm of wasps, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, darting across the screen as he checked his call log. His fingers pounded the keys, each stroke a shot into the void. "Nothing," he said, his voice dry as sand as he turned to Anna. "No trace. Not the first one, not the second one, like they never happened." Anna nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, but inside her mind was racing like caged birds. She hadn't told him about the first call. "You left the window open." And now that silence was like poison, slowly eating away at her. She was afraid he'd ask, but Mark remained silent, his gaze glued to the screen, as if the answers might be hidden there. Lisa walked into the kitchen, her steps light but heavy, as if she were carrying a burden she wasn't talking about. Her hair, pulled back into a loose ponytail, fell around her shoulders, and her eyes, dark as coffee, avoided her mother. "I'm late," she said, her voice quiet but sharp, like a knife cutting through fabric. She grabbed her backpack, her phone blinking with a notification, and Anna felt a chill run down her spine. "Lisa," she said, her words careful as steps on thin ice, "did you call anyone yesterday from my phone?" Her daughter froze, her hand clenching around the backpack. "No," she said, her tone sharp as glass. "Why would I do that?" She left, slamming the door, the sound echoing through the apartment like a hammer blow. Anna looked at Mark, his face still, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a suspicion as thin as smoke but already palpable. "Does she know something?" he asked, his voice low, like the hum of an engine about to stall. Anna shook her head, her fingers tightening on the phone as if it could protect her from the truth. "She's just a teenager," she said, but the words were empty, like a shell washed up on the sea. "It's not her." Mark nodded, but his gaze remained cold as metal, and Anna felt the gap between them widen like a crack in the foundation of a house. By midday, Mark had insisted on visiting the telecom operator, his engineer nature demanding facts, not fears. They drove to an office on the outskirts of town, where grey glass and concrete towers jutted out like teeth rotted by time. The office smelled of plastic and coffee, its walls covered with posters of smiling faces promising communications without borders. The agent, a young man with tired eyes, listened to them, his fingers idly tapping on the keyboard. "No calls from your number at 10:17 p.m., he said, his voice as monotonous as the hum of the overhead lights, or from unknown numbers. "Maybe an app glitch. It happens." Mark frowned, his fist clenching, but he held his tongue, his words like stones falling into water. "Check again," he said, but the guy just shrugged, his gaze as blank as the screen of a switched-off phone. Anna was silent, her hands fiddling with the strap of her bag, but inside she was screaming. She knew it wasn't a glitch, not a joke, not Lisa. The voice was too precise, too close, as if it lived in their house, breathed their air. They returned home, their footsteps echoing loudly in the entryway, where the lights flickered as if the city were winking at them. The apartment greeted them with cold, its silence thicker than in the morning, and Anna felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end when her phone vibrated on the table. The screen flickered to life, showing an MMS, a photo of their kitchen taken from the corner above the sink, where there were no cameras, where there couldn't be cameras. Her mug was on the counter, the same one she'd left out that morning, and in the corner, barely visible, was a silhouette, a shadow too blurry to be a person, but too clear to be a trick of the light. Anna gasped, her hand covering her mouth, but the sound still escaped, like a bird from a cage. Mark came over, his face grey as rain-stained asphalt. "What's that?" he asked, his voice hoarse as the crackle of an old radio. She shook her head, her fingers shaking as she deleted the message, but the image remained in her memory, a stain that wouldn't come out. They checked the kitchen, their movements quick, but useless, like trying to catch the wind. No cameras, no tracks, just the smell of rain seeping through the crack in the window. Mark called the police, his voice firm but cracked, like glass ready to shatter. The officer, an older man with a face like crumpled paper, listened, his pen scratching on his notepad, but his eyes bored. "Maybe kids playing around," he said, his words like dust settling on the floor. "Or an app acting up. Make the password stronger." Mark opened his mouth, but Anna touched his hand, her fingers cold as ice. "Thank you," she said, her voice empty, an echo in an empty house. The policeman left, his footsteps fading into the hallway, and the apartment became their prison again. Anna sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the phone that lay on the table like a bomb ready to explode. Mark stood by the window, his back as tense as a string. "Are you hiding something?" he asked without turning around, his voice as low as the hum of the city outside the glass. Anna shuddered, her heart pounding like a drum calling for war. "No," she answered, but her words were weak like a whisper in a storm. "And you?" He didn't answer, his silence like a knife plunging between them. The phone vibrated again, its screen flashing to show an unfamiliar number. Anna grabbed it, her fingers shaking as she pressed answer. The same voice, cold and distorted, came back, its words like needles digging into skin. "One of you is lying," it said, "but not me." The call ended, and silence fell over the apartment, but it wasn't empty. There was a rustling as if someone was breathing on the other side of the wall, watching from the shadows, knowing everything they were trying to forget. Victor's office smelled of old paper and burnt coffee, its walls covered with yellowed newspaper clippings that held stories the city had chosen to forget. A single overhead lamp hummed, its light flickering, highlighting a metal cabinet piled high with files and a desk covered in scratches like scars. Victor, Anna's friend since her first job at the editorial office, sat at the desk, his fingers leafing through an old notebook, his eyes hidden behind cracked glasses running over the lines as if they could catch the elusive truth. Outside, the city was drowning in grey daylight, its glass and concrete towers jutting out like bones gnawed by time. Anna sat across from him, her hands fiddling with the strap of her bag, her face as pale as a page torn from a book. She told him everything, about the calls, about the photograph of the kitchen, about the voice that knew their fears and lies. Mark had stayed home, his engineer's logic refusing to believe anything that didn't fit into numbers, but Anna couldn't wait. She knew Victor as a man who dug deeper than the police, finding what others were afraid to touch. "This isn't a joke," she said, her voice hoarse as the crackle of old vinyl. It knows us too well." Victor nodded, his fingers hovering over the page where he scrawled, "Calls 2013, disappearance." He stood up, his steps slow, as if he were afraid to disturb the silence. "You're not the first," he said, his voice low like the hum of wires over the city. "I've found similar things. 10 years ago, then 5. People would get calls, not threatening, but precise, about everyday life, about secrets, and then they'd disappear." He pulled a folder out of the cabinet, its edges crumpled as if someone had tried to burn it, but changed their mind. Inside were clippings, photographs, notes, the faces of people whose eyes were as empty as the windows of abandoned houses. "Here," he said, pointing to the article. "The Karpov family, 2013. The calls started with little things. You forgot to lock the door. A month later they left. No one knows where." Anna felt a coldness grip her heart, her fingers tightening around her bag as if it could anchor her to reality. "Why haven't they been looked for?" she asked, her words like stones falling into water. Victor chuckled, his laughter bitter as the taste of ash. "They have been," he said, "but the police don't like cases without evidence. And the calls, they weren't in the billing records like yours." He turned to another page where there was a photograph of a man, his face gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in years. "This is a survivor," Victor said, "Oleg Smirnov. He told me this is not a person. This is a record of your weaknesses." The words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Anna wanted to ask, but her phone vibrated, its screen blazing like a beacon in the night. She looked at it, her hands shaking as she saw the number, her own. "Don't pick it up," Victor said, his voice harsh but anxious. But Anna had already hit answer, her fingers moving on their own, as if someone else was controlling them. The voice, cold and distorted, came out, the words like ice biting into her skin. "You yelled at her yesterday," it said. "Liza was crying in the bathroom. You didn't hear." Anna gasped, her hand covering her mouth, but the sound still escaped, like a bird from a cage. She remembered the fight with Liza, her harsh words about school, but she didn't know that her daughter had been crying. The call ended, and the screen went black, but the silence was louder than the voice. Victor looked at her, his eyes narrow as cracks in the wall. "It was at the Karpovs," he said, his voice quiet, like a whisper from underground. The calls began to quote their lives, petty quarrels, old grievances. He took out an old cassette, its plastic covered in dust like a shroud. "Smirnov left me this," he said, "a recording of one of the calls. I didn't listen, I didn't dare." Anna looked at the cassette, her heart pounding like a drum calling for war. She wanted to take it, but her fingers froze as if the cassette might bite. They returned to the apartment in the evening, the city outside the window grey as ash, its streets humming but the sound distant, like the echo of someone else's life. Mark met them in the living room, his face tense as a string about to snap. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice cold as metal. Anna opened her mouth, but Victor spoke first, his tone as even as the asphalt. "We were testing something," he said. "This is not a joke, Mark. This is something more." Mark frowned, his eyes darting to Anna, and there was a shadow in them, a suspicion that was growing like mold in a corner. Lisa sat in her room, her door closed but a light shining through the crack, blinking like a distress signal. Anna knocked, her fist weak as if she were afraid of the answer. "Lisa," she said, her voice soft but cracked, "we need to talk." The door opened, Lisa standing in the doorway, her eyes red as if she'd been crying, but her face was still like a mask. "About what?" she asked, her voice sharp as glass. Anna wanted to talk about the call, about the voice's words, but the words stuck like bones in her throat. "Just be careful," she said, her words empty as a shell washed up on the sea. That night, Anna lay awake, her eyes glued to the ceiling, where the shadows from the streetlight outside danced like ghosts. Mark lay beside her, his breathing even, but she knew he was awake. His body was tense as a spring. The phone on the nightstand was off, its battery separate. But when it vibrated, its screen lit up like an eye opening in the darkness. Anna gasped, her hand reaching for it, but froze when a voice, cold and distorted, came from the speaker, as if it lived inside. "The phone. You didn't tell him," it said. "About your brother, about what you kept." Anna leapt from the bed, her steps quick, as if she could outrun the words. She turned on the light, her fingers shaking, but the phone was dead, its screen black as a grave. She stood in the living room, her breath ragged like fabric torn by claws. The city outside was silent, its lights flickering like stars dying in the night. She knew the voice was talking about her brother, about the old phone she'd kept after he died, about the messages she'd listened to before she destroyed them. But how did it know? And why was it playing even when the phone was dead? She looked at Lisa's door, her heart tightening as if someone had tightened a noose. She knew she had to tell Mark, but the fear that he wouldn't believe her was stronger than the voice that knew everything. The warehouse on the outskirts of town smelled of rust and damp, its concrete walls cracked and echoing with footsteps like the memory of those long gone. Victor picked his way through piles of old boxes, his flashlight flickering as it picked out rusty pipes and cobwebs hanging like curtains. The floor was littered with shards of glass, crunching under his boots like bones breaking in the silence. He had come here on a tip from Smirnov, a survivor whose words, a record of your weaknesses, had haunted him. Somewhere here, among the forgotten things, might be the key to the calls that were destroying Anna's family. Victor stopped at a metal cabinet, its door slightly open like a mouth about to speak. Inside were old cassettes, their plastic covered. In dust, their labels faded to barely legible. Archive, 2010. He picked one up, his fingers feeling cold, as if the tape had been taken out of water. His phone vibrated, the screen flashing to show Anna's number, but he knew she wasn't calling. She was waiting for him at home, with Mark and Lisa in the apartment that had become a cage. He hung up, his heart pounding like a drum, but the silence of the warehouse was louder than the ringing. Anna sat in the living room, her hands clutching a mug, but the tea in it was as cold as her fingers. The light from the chandelier flickered, its shadows crawling along the walls like spiders spinning a web. Mark stood by the door, his face as grey as the concrete outside, his eyes dark and narrow, looking at her as if she were a stranger. Lisa sat on the sofa, her knees pulled up to her chest, her phone lying next to her, its screen dark, but she kept her eyes on it, as if it might come to life. After the ringing that came from the switched-off phone, they stopped talking, their words dissolving into a silence as thick as oil filling the lungs. "We have to leave," Mark said, his voice hoarse as the crack of old wood. "This isn't normal." Anna nodded, but her eyes were empty, like a window, with the city humming past them, oblivious. She hadn't told him about her brother, about the old phone she'd kept after he died, about the messages she'd listened to at night, before she'd smashed it a year ago. The voice knew, and the words, "You didn't tell him," were like a knife stabbing her heart. She wanted to speak, but the fear that Mark wouldn't believe her was stronger than her voice. The phones on the table, hers, Mark's, Lisa's, vibrated. Simultaneously, their screens flashing like eyes opening in the dark. Anna gasped, her hand reaching for hers, but froze as a voice, cold and distorted, came from all three, the words like needles digging into skin. "You yelled at her," it said, quoting the argument Anna had had with Lisa. "You said she wasn't yours," it continued, turning to Mark, its voice an echo of their argument 3 years ago when he had thrown those words at Lisa in anger. "You cried because you were afraid of losing them," it finished, and Lisa flinched, her eyes filling with tears, as if the voice had revealed a secret. Anna looked at Mark. His face was still, but there was a storm in his eyes, ready to tear everything apart. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice weak like a whisper in the void. Mark opened his mouth, but the words stuck like bones in his throat. Lisa stood up. Her steps were quick, as if she could run from the truth, and slammed the door of her room, the sound echoing in the apartment like a gunshot. Anna was left alone with Mark. Their eyes met, but between them there was an abyss, cold and deep, like the sea outside the city. Victor returned at night, his coat wet from the dampness of the warehouse, and in his hands was a cassette tape, its label reading, "Recording 2013. He entered the apartment, his steps heavy, like stones falling into water. "I found this," he said, his voice low like the hum of wires. "It might be related." Anna looked at the tape, her heart clenching as if someone had tightened a noose. She remembered the old phone, its broken casing, her brother's messages, that she had erased, but that still sounded in her head like an echo that refused to die. They turned on the old tape recorder, its reels creaking like bones coming to life in the night. The voice on the tape was the same, cold, distorted, but the words were different. "You left the light on. He saw you." Anna gasped, her hand covering her mouth, but the sound still escaped, like a bird from a cage. It wasn't their recording. But the voice was the same, as if it lived outside of time, outside of space. Victor turned off the tape recorder, his fingers shaking like leaves in the wind. "These aren't just calls," he said, his voice quiet, like a whisper from underground. "This is something that knows you." Anna stood up, her steps slow, as if she were carrying a heavy load. She walked to the window, her fingers touching the glass, cold as ice. The city outside was grey, its lights flickering like stars dying in the night. She remembered her brother, his voice, his laughter, and the phone she had destroyed to forget the pain. But the voice knew, and its words, "I am the memory you did not throw away until the end," rang in her head like a bell that could not be reset. She turned, her eyes meeting Mark's, but there was no warmth in them, only cold, like the voice that spoke from their phones. Lisa's phone vibrated on the couch, its screen flashing to show her own number. Anna grabbed it, her fingers shaking as she pressed answer. A voice spoke, its words like ash falling to the ground. "You shouldn't have kept quiet," it said. "They won't forgive." The call ended, and silence fell over the apartment, but it wasn't empty. There was a rustling, as if someone was watching from the shadows, knew everything they were trying to hide. The new apartment smelled of fresh paint and other people's lives. Its bare walls, not yet touched by wallpaper, reflected the light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling like a gallows. Anna sat on a cardboard box, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sleeve, her eyes empty as the glass of an abandoned house, looking at a pile of unpacked things. The new city, 100 kilometers from the old one, was quiet. Its streets, grey and faceless, hummed in the distance, but their noise did not penetrate here, leaving only silence, thick as resin. 3 days without calls, without a voice, without a shadow that knew their secrets. But the silence was not salvation. It was a cage, squeezing them more tightly than fear. Mark stood by the window, his silhouette dark as a paper cutout, his hands in his pockets motionless, as if he were afraid to move. Lisa sat on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest, and the new phone, with a clean SIM card, lay next to her, its screen dark. But she kept her eyes on it, as if she were waiting for him to speak. They had moved in a hurry, leaving behind the old apartment, the old life like clothes soaked in smoke, new numbers, new locks, a new address, everything to cut off the voice that quoted their quarrels, their pain, their past. But Anna knew that the past does not go away. It lives inside you, like an echo that cannot be muffled. She hadn't slept since the night the voice came from the switched-off phone. Its words, "You shouldn't have kept quiet," like a splinter in her mind. She told Mark about her brother, about the old phone she kept after his death, about the messages she listened to before she smashed the device. Mark was silent. His face was motionless as concrete, but there was a shadow in his eyes. Not anger, not pain, but emptiness, as if he were looking at a stranger. Lisa, hearing this, went to her room. Her door slammed like a gunshot, and from then on she spoke only in whispers, as if she was afraid that the voice would hear. Victor remained in the old city, his voice hoarse and tired in the last call. "I'll dig, but you run." He promised to find the source, a tape, a server, anything that could have produced the voice. But Anna didn't believe in answers. The voice wasn't a machine, wasn't a person. It was their shadow, their memory, their lies, living in the walls, in the wires, in their own words. She looked at Mark, his back tense like a string about to snap. "Did we do it right?" she asked, her voice weak, a whisper in the void. He didn't answer, his silence a knife stabbing between them. Liza stood up, her steps light but heavy, as if she were carrying a burden she wasn't talking about. "I want to sleep," she said, her eyes red as if she'd been crying, but her face still as a mask. She went into her room, her door closing with a soft click, but the sound was louder than the silence that remained in the apartment. Anna looked at the boxes, at their labels, kitchen, books, Lisa's things, and felt a cold squeeze her heart. They had moved, but they hadn't fled. They hadn't freed themselves. The voice was with them, in their looks, in their silence, in their fear. Night had fallen on the city, its darkness soft but sticky, like ink spilled on paper. Anna sat on the box, her fingers fiddling with her new phone, its screen blank. No notifications, no trace of the past. Mark had gone to bed, his footsteps quiet in the bedroom, but she knew he was awake. His breathing was ragged, like a signal, faltering in the air. She stood, her steps slow, as if she were afraid to wake the silence, and went to the window. The city beyond the glass was alien, its lights flickering like stars she didn't know. She closed her eyes, her breath ragged, like fabric torn by claws, and remembered her brother, his laughter, his voice, his last message, "I'll always be here." The phone vibrated on the box, its screen flashing like an eye opening in the darkness. Anna turned, her heart pounding like a drum calling to war. The notification read, "New voicemail from you." She grabbed the phone, her fingers shaking as she hit play. A voice, cold and distorted, came on, its words like ash falling to the ground. "Moving doesn't erase whispers," it said. "It makes them louder." The sound cut off. The screen went blank. But the silence wasn't empty. There was a rustling in it, as if someone was breathing on the other side of the wall, watching from the shadows, knowing everything they were trying to forget. Anna gasped, her hand covering her mouth, but the sound still escaped, like a bird from a cage. She looked at Lisa's door, her heart tightening as if someone had tightened a noose. She wanted to call Mark, but the words were stuck like bones in her throat. She knew the voice would not go away, would not disappear, would not be silent. It was their memory, their lies, their pain that lived inside them like a shadow, following the light. She sat on the box, her eyes glued to the phone, its screen dark, but she felt it watching her, waiting for her to break. Morning came. Its light, gray like ash, settling on the city. Mark was silent, his gaze empty, like a window with nothing behind it. Lisa left the room, her face pale as paper, her eyes avoiding her mother. They sat at the table, their movements mechanical, like puppets whose strings had long since become tangled. Anna wanted to speak, to say that her voice had returned, but her voice was dead, like the telephone lying before her. They ate, their spoons clattering on their plates, but the sound was distant, like the echo of someone else's life. The city outside the window was humming, its streets were full of people. But Anna, Mark, and Lisa were alone, their apartment an island surrounded by a sea of silence. The voice no longer rang, but its words, "He makes it louder," lived in their heads like a ringing that could not be silenced. They looked at each other, their faces masks hiding the fear, the guilt, the love they had lost. Anna knew that the period had been set. But it was not the end. It was the beginning of a new silence, in which their whispers became louder than they could bear.